Chapter 1. The Rise of Man. Adam awoke beneath an apple tree. He was sitting atop a luscious patch of warm green grass, and above him he could see what he instinctively knew was an apple tree. Something inside him was telling him that the fruit that this tree provided, the shiny, bright red apples, were exactly what he needed to keep his growing hunger at bay. Hunger, even as a new concept, was obvious as a feeling to Adam, and it meant that all he could think about for this very moment was food. Although this was the first time that Adam had ever been conscious in his entire existence, having been generated this very moment, on this very day, it was rather a surprise to him that he simply seemed to just know things. For instance, he knew what apples were, and that he could eat them. He knew he could drink the water from the river to keep his thirst at bay, and he knew as though it was within his very nature that snakes were never to be trusted. He didn't quite know what a snake was, as he couldn't actually see one, but none of that mattered. He was here, alive and well. Adam had no clothes to speak of, and that was the second place that his mind went to as he brought himself to his full height. There were no other humans around, of course, though he wasn't fully aware of that fact, so we can give him a little slack on that front. But somewhere deep inside his very genetic coding, embarrassment had seated itself and had at this very moment grown into a mighty oak. Of course, we should not draw any comparisons between mighty oaks and, well, never mind. The salient facts were that Adam was and was embarrassed about it. He placed his hands in front of his exposed man parts. After all, it is within the very instinct of every single man ever to do his best to keep those things safe. And if we could fashion some kind of tiny cage to keep them safe, then all the better. "What can I cover myself with?" Adam's internal monologue asked, as he searched around himself for something that would work as adequate clothing. It was strange, as clothing had not been invented by the game, or more accurately the artificial intelligence that ruled freedom yet. Again, Adam knew what it was, and that he needed it. Eventually, Adam's eyes landed upon a river not far from where he stood. He had first imagined that some kind of large leaf would suffice, but when he had actually tested this approach, all of the leaves that he found around himself were really rather small, and that just wasn't going to do for him. When he spied the nearby river, though, he noticed the long green reeds protruding from the water near the edge, and decided that braiding a few of them together could probably work as makeshift underwear. Walking over to the river with a very smug look upon his face, Adam leant over to the reeds and pulled a handful of them free from the water. They looked perfect for what he wanted, so he leant across again to gather more, though he failed to notice the fish that swam just beneath the surface of the water, using his own shadow as cover for their malintent. The fish beneath him each had a single row of tiny, jagged teeth, and a penchant for worms, or at least what they thought was a worm. As Adam retrieved his second handful of reeds, he felt a burning, kind of tingling sensation down below him. Then, as the feeling made itself truly known, he let out an ear-piercing scream and looked down to see that a small fish, about the size of his palm, had attached itself to one of his unprotected and very sensitive plums. "Fall!" he screamed and leapt back away from the water, all but forgetting about his gathering task and the shame of his nudity, as this new problem was far too important. He ran a few paces away from the water before realizing that it was simply no good the thing had latched itself on there, and when he concentrated on himself, he knew that his health bar had begun to fall. He could practically visualize the red bar at the bottom of his vision, and although it was falling slowly, it was still noticeable nonetheless. Giving up on running, Adam stopped to try a new approach. Every move he made that seemed to jiggle the fish was like torture to him, and more than anything else, he simply wanted to throw his guts up gingerly He reached down and tried his best to insert his fingers into the corners of the fish's mouth. All that we can say about this particular effort is, thank God fish have big mouths. Adam managed to place a finger into its mouth and prise it off before he let out a sigh of relief. The fish, though, was not done. Now it had a new worm-like target in the way of Adam's finger, and it bit down with all of its might. Again, Adam felt his health bar fall ever so slightly and wondered just how bad things could get if there were a great number of the fish attacking him all at once. Thankfully for Adam, though, this fish was on dry land, his playing field, and if he knew anything about fish, which up until about 30 seconds ago, well, actually he didn't, then he knew that this fish would be dead, suffocated by way of happenstance in just a matter of moments. Adam was, of course, correct. The fish floundered once he had managed to tear his finger from its mouth, and then, in what seemed to be a fairly overdramatic need for attention, the fish coughed once, then died right there on the ground. Something happened that Adam realized that he had been expecting then. He felt the small amount of XP that he had gained from killing the tiny creature flow into his body and move his internal experience bar along, away from 0, and to a tiny percent, up the scale along the way towards his next level. He was also now entirely aware that he was currently just level 1, and that meant that, realistically speaking, if a few fish decided to jump him all at once down a dark alley whilst he wasn't expecting it, he would be a goner. Whilst he was contemplating his own fragile existence, Adam also found that within himself he had a skill that he had been unaware of until right at that moment. He knew somehow that it had been there all along, though when he really thought about it, he could tell what it was. It was strange. Adam knew that all of this knowledge resided within him as if it was there all along, though it was until he actually thought about anything that he understood its meaning and its consequences upon himself. Adam saw that not only was he just level 1, but he also had a skill sitting at level 1, building. It was when he looked at the skill in more detail that he simply knew what his calling in life was. It was also clear to him that until he had mastered this skill, which would be at level 10, he would be unable to learn anything different. Adam was a builder, and that was that. He had his calling, his raison d'etre, and there was no fighting that. This was one of the few differences between an NPC non-player character within Freedom and one of the visitors from the real world. Until an NPC had fulfilled their destiny, they were without the ability to choose their own path in life. Then, from the corner of his vision, emerging from the otherwise calm and still blue waters that constituted the wide lake, Adam saw something that should not have been. From the water slipped a 15-foot crocodile, and without even having to look, he could tell that it was level 8, a far cry above what he knew he would be able to manage in a fair fight. Knowing that these beasts could outrun him even on land, Adam bolted away from the creature and pulled himself up to the lowest hanging branches of the nearest tree. Crocodiles, he knew, although agile in water and on land, were not as adept at climbing as the average man was. Once the crocodile realized that his prey had decided to run away, it increased its speed, although it was unable to beat Adam to the tree. It hissed and snapped at the base of the trunk, though to Adam's relief he knew that whilst he was up high and off of the ground, he was safe. However, this meant that now he was trapped, and all the time that the level 8 beast hung about beneath him, he would be unable to gather food or water, and inevitably, in this battle of attrition, one of them was going to have to blink first. The phrase was shown to eventually been literal. After a few short hours, Adam, tired and hungry, fell asleep. "Hey, you up there!" A man's shout brought Adam back to consciousness. He started so hard that he almost fell off his branch. He wiped the drool from the side of his mouth and stared down at whoever had called up to him. Standing below him on the ground were a group of 10 men and women, staring up at him with bemused expressions on their faces. "Hello," he called back down. "What are you doing up there?" one of the men called up. "And why are you?" Then it dawned on Adam these people were all dressed in cloth wrappings, not a single dangly bit out on show for all the world to see. "I didn't have any clothes," Adam called back down. "And I'm up here because of the crocodile." He peered about as though searching for the beast, but it was nowhere to be seen. "No crocodiles around here, friend," the man replied. "Just us, and whoever else we find along the way." Adam looked at all of the people rather suspiciously before he concluded that these people weren't there to cause him harm. They looked like normal folks, and it made him realize just how much he had been yearning for company. He climbed down the tree gingerly, terribly aware that everyone could probably have seen the entirety of his goods as he did so, and came to a stand before the man who had been speaking. Then he covered his genitals with his hands as if an afterthought. "Where did you get all those clothes?" Adam asked. "Oh, don't worry. Melissa is a tailor, and she has enough cloth back there to make you some basic wrapping," the man said. "We all started off, so don't worry about it. I was only joking with you." Then a woman made her way through the group and handed Adam a small bundle of cloth that he unfurled and immediately wrapped around himself. She was tall and thin, her hair was pure white, and her ears protruded through the strands at the side of her head and culminated in a sharp point at the tip. This Melissa was clearly an elf. He knew it without even having to guess. Melissa was silent in her act, and as she retreated from Adam, he watched her go similarly silently. Then he realized that about half of the group were elves and half humans, and no matter how he attempted to analyze that fact, it just seemed so normal to him. Adam slipped on the cloth wrappings as quickly as he could and rose back to his full height before the man who had been acting as the sole representative for the group so far. "My name is Samson, and I am an ambassador and human, like you. You know Melissa already. The humans of the group are Harry and Jack, both warriors, Shaw's a chef, and Ayla a horticulturalist. The elves are Melissa, Irina, Lily, Jax, and Kira, who are a tailor, healer, fire mage, arboriculturalist, and huntress, respectively. I trust that you understand all of this?" Samson's voice was official, though not condescending, and instinctively Adam knew that this was a perk of his ambassador skill. He also knew exactly what all of those professions were and what they meant. What Adam didn't know, though, was where the warriors had received their short steel swords from, or where the elf huntress Kira had got her bows and arrows. It seemed unfair to him that he had appeared with nothing to hand, whereas these people seemed to have received a helping hand from the unknown. "Where did you get all your stuff?" Adam asked. Then added, "I'm Adam, by the way." Well, we did not all receive such a blessing, though the warriors and the huntress did receive a weapon to use. Perhaps because their trade requires them to do battle to increase their level, the powers that govern this world saw fit to equip them in their endeavor, Samson explained. That made sense to Adam. What good would it be to be a warrior if at level 1 you simply got into a fight, then immediately died? Plus, his own profession required no such tools, simply materials and a direction to go in. "We all began this life alone," Samson continued. "We each wandered through the barren lands and found each other one by one as wandering souls. It would seem to me that the breakdown of our small party would lend itself to the creation of a camp or settlement for all our safety. Wouldn't you agree?" "Yeah, I suppose," Adam said. My skill seems to increase with the more words that I construct my sentences from, Samson said quietly. So it may seem on occasion the things that could be said with fewer words. It is difficult to get the correct balance sometimes, so forgive me if I get a little wordy whilst we converse. It's okay, Adam replied. Anything for a little experience, right? Correct, Samson replied, though Adam knew that a nod would have sufficed. So, onward then, Samson announced loudly for all to hear. We must discover if there are any others in the nearby vicinity that can aid in our search for settlement and safety. Then under his breath he muttered, Seriously, this is as, annoying for me as it is for you. It made Adam smile. He liked this man. Although the group walked for what seemed like forever, they concluded that there was no one else in the immediate vicinity to be found. What they did find, though, not far from the river, was a wide-open, flat clearing that seemed as though it had been created specifically for the group to build their campsite upon. They had discussed placing it within the woods, using the trees for cover, but agreed that a wide-open field would provide an early warning system should anyone wish to find shelter with them. They were yet to discover any threats to their existence, so it made sense to all to remain visible until it was no longer safe to do so. Well, this seems as good a spot as any to make camp, right? Samson eventually stated as the group came to a halt in the center of the plains. The group all meandered about for a moment with some sitting down on the grass. Nobody spoke a word, and nobody seemed to know exactly what it was that they were supposed to be doing. It eventually dawned on Adam that they were waiting for him to do something. You are a builder, are you not? Samson asked him quietly, though Adam knew that the others could surely hear. He seemed always to make a big show about the right way to do things, another quirk of his skill, he supposed. Well, I am, but what would you like me to build with, and what? Adam asked. Even a master builder would require building materials with which to work, just as an artist would require canvas and oils, or a sculptor a block of marble or stone. Ah, yes, Samson stated. Here comes the fun part. Jax. He called out to the Elven arboriculturalist, who stood up from his seated position on the ground and walked over to the two humans. Adam, this is Jax. He will be helping you out with your material gathering today, Samson announced, sweeping his hand out towards the elf, who looked as though he was about as sure at the whole situation as Adam was. Jax then placed his palms at the waist height above the ground, facing downwards, and immediately from the ground sprouted a tree trunk of about a foot in diameter. The trunk was so straight that it looked almost unnatural as it grew, and when it was about 6 feet long, its base began to rot and decay until it snapped, falling to the ground and laying flat in place. Holy Adam exclaimed as the tree fell. As he looked at it, he could see that each end was perfectly flat and undamaged, and instinctively he knew that with a few of these trunks, he would be able to put his skill to good use. The felling of the trunk, though, looked as though it had pained Jax, and Adam felt the twinge of unhappiness come from the elf, though neither of them said anything at all. What was more important was that shelter could now be constructed. Over the following few days, Adam worked with Jax to create wooden cabins and a small wall around their new campsite. Whilst they were busy, the rest of the group hunted, fished, and cooked, so that the members of the new settlement could survive with nothing other than what nature had provided for them. Melissa had also started to embellish her clothing designs to make them something more than the cloth that the initial rags were made from, and Lily had proven that, as a fire mage, the group would never suffer from the cold. In a lot of ways, the group was the perfect unit, both to survive and grow within the lands of freedom. The only person that didn't seem to have an immediate task was Samson himself, though he did seem useful in directing each of the group in their own tasks. It only took 3 days, though, before the warriors were called into action, as from within the forest, a troop of orcs emerged groggily, looking for their next taste of meat. It was midday, and the sun was high in the sky. The walls of the campsite were simply too small to be of any real deterrent. They were more there as a marker than as a defensive structure. And with Kira out hunting, all that was left to defend the group were the two human warriors, Jack and Harry, along with their short steel swords. The warriors had been training against each other and with some of the animals that they could find in the woods, but they had each only reached level 3, and the war band of 5 orcs that were approaching were all between level 2 and 5. Not only did they have the advantage of numbers, but as an average, their levels were greater too. The orcs looked as menacing as Adam could have ever imagined. They were about the same height as the humans, though their skin was a greenish-brown and their bottom teeth protruded from their lips. Saliva dripped from their mouths as they bore down on the campsite menacingly, and once they were close enough to make out properly, Adam could see that they were each carrying a large, dangerous-looking cleaver. Good day to you, friends. Welcome to our settlement. Is there anything that we can help you with? Samson called out rather cautiously from behind the 2 warriors who held their swords to the ready. The orcs, surprisingly, did not respond. They simply kept coming towards the settlement, and within a few moments they would make it to the wall, which at just 2 logs high stood at about 3 feet. Harry and Jack both moved into position on the inside of the wall and awaited the arrival of their very first enemies within the lands of freedom. Orc number 1 bundled across the wall as though he couldn't wait to reach the feast that the group provided in that of their flesh. As he did so, he elected to roll over the small wall and so presented himself as a rather easy target for the 2 warriors who had no problems in ending his life rather swiftly. The second orc managed to jump from atop the wall and launch himself toward the humans with little regard for his own safety. Jack managed to step out of the way, but Harry was bundled to the ground beneath the horrifying creature. The orc then rose his cleaver high above his head to land the killing blow, but as he was about to unleash his fury, the tip of Jack's sword appeared in his stomach. Before the vile creature had managed to end Harry's life, he had been slain by the human's comrade. Adam watched the scene unfold with his mouth agape. It was like these things had gone mad with hunger. They fought without any semblance of technique or sense of unity, throwing themselves into battle as though they wanted to reach their target regardless of what state they ended up in. This was not, Adam thought, how he would go about conducting himself in battle if he ever needed to, which now seemed like a far greater possibility than it had been the previous day. There were just 3 of the orcs left now, though, so it seemed as though the odds were drawing closer to level with each passing moment. What nobody had been expecting after seeing the first 2 fight, though, was that the remaining 3 had decided to think a little more tactically. Splitting up, they spread themselves around the settlement so that there was no way that the 2 human warriors would be able to look after everyone at once. As a group, all of the orcs stepped onto the wall at once, and although Harry and Jack moved immediately to engage, it was clear that the 2 that they began their combat with were far better trained than their fallen compatriots. Also, there was one who had not been met by a defender, and that spelled disaster for everyone left in the settlement. "To the center! Back to back!" Adam cried before anyone else could say a word. Dutifully, the 7 remaining individuals within moved to the center of the settlement, and as far away from the menacing orc as possible. It did seem that 7 against 1 could have been doable, but this thing was a warrior with a weapon, and the people of the settlement had no skill in fighting and no weapons, save for a few sticks littered about the floor. Adam picked up a short stick and tried to look as though he knew what he was doing. A couple of the others followed suit, though it was clear that neither these nor the untrained people were going to be much use in a fight. The orc, upon seeing the action, seemed to sneer and did not stop in his menacing approach. It took but a moment for it to come into range of the huddled group. The sounds of fighting rang out from the two warriors, although there was no time for anyone to turn to look to see how the humans were faring in their own battle. Adam called upon all of his might and swung his stick down atop the orc's head. It snapped immediately upon impact, and the creature's eyes moved upward as though confused as to what had just happened, though it seemed to have had no effect. Then his gaze fell back upon Adam, who was now frozen to the spot. The orc then unceremoniously raised his cleaver high into the air and hit Adam with a strike that bore the force of nothing he had ever experienced before. The blade bit into his flesh, and he felt his collarbone break upon impact, though somehow it had managed to stop the cleaver from taking his head clean off. Adam fell to the ground, the warm grass caressing his skin, then darkening with the deep red of his own thick blood. Adam's consciousness returned to him a short while later, when he managed to open his eyes, shaking off the unconscious debuff. The first thing that he was greeted with was the deep blue eyes of the Elven healer, Irene, as she wove her spell of healing magic to help mend his wounds. Beyond the healer, though, Adam could see that the orc that had almost killed him had himself been dropped by a single arrow that still protruded from the back of his skull. It seemed that the elven huntress, Kira, had arrived back at the settlement, just in time to prevent anyone from actually being killed. Well, this time at least. Days, weeks, and months followed the first attack by the orcs, and as time went by, there were others. The attackers became better skilled, leveled, and equipped, though the ingenuity of the humans, paired with the guile of the elven people, meant that they too grew as the time passed. More people also had shown up at the settlement once they had learned of its presence out there in the open. Settlement had turned to village and was on the cusp of a township when it all went to This time, though, it would not be the external threat of attackers or invaders that threatened the village's very existence. The threat now came from within. It was inevitable, of course, as it always was with the groups of people. The differences of opinion would emerge. The elves were unhappy that the humans seemed so cavalier with the construction of wooden articles. They worshipped the woods as well as all living things, and to be made to grow and then immediately destroy the trunks that were to be used for walls and floors just did not sit well with them. There was, of course, no alternative for the settlement that fought so hard to be a beacon of hope in the lands of freedom. It did not help either that as more and more humans and elves arrived at the settlement, the races began to separate and distrust each other. Eventually, the time came when the elves decided that they were going to leave the settlement, and by all accounts, the humans were happy about it. As truth be told, they were very close to forcibly throwing them out as it was. There would never be an alliance between the humans and the elves of freedom after this parting. This very moment had created a chasm between the two races that would ripple through the ages and affect mindsets and actions of future generations to come.